Continuing, this idea of the reconciliation of the two opposites that sort of merge into this idea of the dove or the phoenix or the goose. So that was the first the black stage, the idea of the burning or the coal or that all of that like sort of destruction, burning down things into remnants and then gradually going from the remnants and reconstituting them. The second stage is this watery stage of doves, and you know there's a lot of water and milk and liquor, and like I mentioned before, the wash basin and the distillation, and this idea of the ultimate destination being the geese farming in the meadow. And the geese need their common, this idea. Um, so that is also about tapping into the unconscious, where the first one's really kind of about the Jungian shadow, the second one's really about the conscious, making the unconscious conscious, and how she, Lenore Dove, leads Hamish through this idea of the unconscious. And also, I think it's significant that Hamish, Suzanne made Hamish's birthday July 4th, which makes him a Cancer, which makes him associated with the moon and water and these sort of like um, fertile water kind of imagery, but also this idea of like the home and this idea of the this almost like maternal imagery. Suzanne's often like she's inverting this idea because she makes Katniss take on these sort of quote unquote sort of masculine active role, and then Peta is more of like the nourishing cooking one kind of thing. That's like an inversion, and then in this idea of Haymitch being receptive to the fire of um, Lenore and her visionary spirit. That's an inversion of these, quote unquote, sort of gender binaries of like the animus and anima, which are deeper than that, but like on the surface, they seem like gender binaries. Um, and one is often getting associated with receptive versus active, all of that. Baptism. She lets him know that there are ideals and dreams to fulfill, all of that. Pause to read if you want. And that was from, I've cited them too in the slides, but I cited a few different articles and a few different websites and books and things like that. So the rubedo is the third stage. So it's kind of enlightenment. You create this idea of the philosopher's stone, which is this egg-shaped ruby. So it's significant that he gets an egg at the end from Katniss, and they incubate the egg. And it's the kind of dawn, like it's the new dawn of a new day, of a new era. Um, there's a lot of, this idea of pelicans. This was a medieval conception where they compared pelicans to Jesus, in that they said that they thought for some reason that pelicans would peck into their breast and they would feed their young through their own blood. They had weird ideas about birds. Then a lot of different weird hypotheses about birds. But that was one of them, and it's a profound symbol, even if it's wrong. So I was thinking of that in terms of Haymitch being this mentor to all of these children, and eventually succeeding with Haymitch, with Katniss and Peeta, and you can see all of the sort of phoenix imagery in Mockingjay, especially, and starting in kind of Catching Fire. Um, there's less of that in this. This is seemed much more like. At first, I thought it was all albedo, and then the more I thought about it, I was like, no, there's definitely some. There's a lot of this like Dark Night of the Soul imagery first, and then continuing to the albedo. Um, this idea, like I mentioned, the berms, he uses a lance to prop open the berm that he gets into the sub basement of the arena, or whatever he calls it, um, for the sort of half baked rebel plot to drown the brain of the arena. And then he uses an axe, so similar, iron, destructive, to ping off of the force field and win. And then also there's this whole other subset that I haven't even gotten into. We could talk forever about how like alchemy is basically the idea, you can think of it in terms of the idea of making wine and making a spirit, like distilling a spirit from grapes. And it's notable that he keeps referring, he starts off distilling, I think it's the corn, with Hattie, who I'm not sure. I mean, I'm assuming Hattie becomes Ripper. I don't know how she loses her arm. Or maybe it's a different person that has taken on the distilling. So questions about that. Um, so he starts off saying, "Oh, I don't drink," and then then he gets grape juice in the arena. And they make a big deal of the grape juice, and then he ends up going to sleep syrup, and then he ends up hanging on through the this spirit of this white liquor. Um, and then that is in a way what takes him to the end, which is this whole restoration of Eden that they find at the end of Mockingjay. And then also, I thought this was interesting that one of the things, like the Philosopher's Stone, was the end product of this whole great work. It's yeast, and yeast is what makes dough rise, which feels very Pita to me. They need all of these different conditions for things to be perfect, and he's what allows the bread of Panem to rise, you could say. Uh, and there's also this whole this like bread theme of Snow using bread and milk to soak up the poison, and him giving them bread and all of that. Okay, and then there's a lot of bird imagery, which I want to expand this section, but I wanted to give a brief intro of it. And this is from a article called "Birds and Alchemy." So there's this idea of flight of birds, which sort of tethers them to the spirit realm, and then all these different birds come in at different parts of the alchemical process. And there's a lot of birds in this novel. So there's the black, like a raven is the beginning, and the symbolism of the stark night of the soul. And we get the raven poem. And then the it's like a foretelling of doom and death and this processing of death that he's doing throughout his whole journey. And then we have the dove. She says it's a gray dove, a Lenore dove. And then we have his geese, and he doesn't say which kind of geese they are, but they're some kind of geese, which could be white, which could symbolize this idea of this purified, Holy Spirit kind of waterfowl. There's a lot of, you can see that as swans, or, as I mentioned, pelicans or geese. What else? Gracefully moving on the surface of the water. They have an etheric interface with the physical. And then the peacock, as we mentioned before, the cauda pavonis is important in the whole alchemical work. Formerly unconscious, and they open up the etheric forces in the astral body as a progression from the black crow. So I have to really think about and parse like the whole bird imagery, but feels significant. Sulfur, I talked about the pelican already, and the phoenix becomes the Mockingjay, kind of becomes the phoenix, and even the fact not only that she sets her two outfits kind of on fire, but then eventually she ends up in that whole extreme explosion that ends the whole war. She gets burned, so she literally is like sloughing off her skin, and becoming a new, like, call her like a new baby chick, is what she says. He now stands upon the surface of the spiritual. So, a lot of bird imagery. Phoenix sets its funeral pyre and then sets itself alight and cremates itself. More about the peacock. The bird flies during the night without wings. Ascending and descending. This is the idea of like condensation, like basically how you distill things, to my knowledge, is that you kind of boil them with a top that catches the steam, and so you boil off kind of the water or the impure matter, and then the steam kind of reconstitutes and falls back into the vessel that you have, and that gives you the purest reduction of the essence of the thing. Final note This one is what's with the toad imagery. And I also found this cracked me up. The fascinating origins of DMT, unveiling the mysteries of the enigmatic toad. And the more I thought about it, they talk about their stylist Magno. He's trying to get high of eating toads or licking toads rather, and a DMT is, I guess it's like, supposedly this substance that your brain releases right before you're about to die. That's like incredibly euphoric and like mind blowing. And so him sort of trying to microdose that or macrodose that is symbolic of him like taking taking advantage of and profiting off of the death of all of these young kids in the Hunger Games. So he's, um, you know, sort of macrodosing death or the high of these life and death experiences without really going through them himself. This was a whole other essay I found about toads in alchemy. And toads wearing precious jewels in their heads, the heads coming up yet again. You can pause this to read this. And toad drinks of the juice of grapes, and it begins to swell. All of these people getting poisoned in the arena, and then the poisoning of the gumdrops and all that. This idea of the apple, and the idea of actually there is this sort of black toad shape that kind of forms in the various stages, and then it becomes this sort of dove. But that was interesting. And then there's just this hilarious poem about milk, suckling milk, and then, suckling the juice of grapes and using it to form poison, which is like such a big theme in this book, too. So that's what I have for right now. Could continue to work on this, but thought this was interesting.